Good morning, everyone. Our group will discuss the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, the African. We will find out who is the person that changed his name to Gustavo Vasa. This story is written by himself. Before we proceed to our story, let me ask a question. Do you feel hardship and the only thing you can do is crying or talking to the Lord, or you do not have any chance but to keep going in life? In this story, we will see all the experiences and sufferings of Equiano, starting from his young age being an abolitionist. So what is abolitionist? Abolitionist means a complete end to slavery. Olaudah regarded himself as a particular favorite of heaven. He acknowledged the mercies of Providence from all the sufferings he experienced. He was named Olaudah, that signifies vicissitude on their language or fortune, one favored and having a loud voice and well spoken. He was born in 1745 in a charming village named Esaka. His father was one of the embranche or mark of grandeur who punished crimes. He shared about his country Africa, which the trade for slaves is carried on. He also shared about their manners and customs, marriage ceremony, which is sacred as the honor of marriage of bed, public entertainments having musical instruments, mode of living, dress, that both sexes have the same dress, and their favorite color is dyed blue, and women wears golden ornaments. He also shared about manufacturers' buildings as they study convenience, commerce, agriculture, which is their chief employment, religion, and war, that their whole district is a kind of militia, meaning a men or women are available in any war for local defense, superstitions that native believes that there is one creator of all things and that he lives in the sun, funeral ceremonies of the priests or magicians, which he calls Afowe Waika, that signifies calculators or yearly men, or their year being called Afowe, and consider them as doctors or physicians. Lastly, their curiosity in discovering poison and hints concerning the origin of their people. Let us see how Equiano was being kidnapped with his sister. Children played outside their house when older people went to work, but they had looked out on the tree to see if there were slave catchers or kidnappers coming to their place. At the age of 11, when older people were not around, Equiano was being kidnapped with his sister in their house because men and women got over their walls. Those kidnappers tied their hands and brought them to other places. They put Equiano and his sister in a larger sack. But one day, a great sorrow came to Equiano when he was being separated by his sister. Equiano came into the hands of a chieftain, and it became his first master. The chieftain's family trusted Equiano, and he used this opportunity to find the way to his home. But an unlucky event happened. He accidentally killed a chicken while taking care of the poultry. The old slave threatened him that he would suffer because of what he did, so he ran and hid himself in the bushes. At night, he was faint and hungry. So he went back to his master's kitchen and hid in the shed. The old woman slave saw him and told it to his master, but he reprimanded Equiano. So he was sold again. He met his sister, but they became separated again. He was sold at Tinma to a wealthy widow who had a son and became his friend. He felt he was part of their family because of their good treatment. But sadly, he was sold again and went to the slave ship. At this time, he couldn't understand other languages, and he was afraid of the white people because he thought that he would be eaten by them. At last, they came to the island of Barbados, The white people told them that they will work. Equiano witnessed the horrors of slavery and despaired of asking the Christians how they accept the behavior and situation they encountered at that time. They landed in Virginia country where there are few native Africans were there. At that time he wished for death, but one gentleman sent him to his dwelling house. Equiano saw a black woman slave who was cooking and cold as the iron muzzle, while he took the fan to his master. He was called Jacob in this place, while on the board he was called Michael. A friend of the gentleman, who was a lieutenant named Michael Henry Pascal, saw him and purchased him. While he was on the ship, the captain and his master Pascal named him Gustavus Vasa. On the ship, he met a friend named Richard Baker or Dick, who was a native of America, and he became Equiano's companion and instructor. Equiano was about 12 years of age when they arrived in England in the town of Falmouth in 1757. And in this time, he was confused with the snow. The ship sailed for Guernsey, so Equiano and Dick stayed there until Pascal was assigned to a warship called the Roebuck. The boat went off, so Pascal brought them to a large ship. Equiano was amazed to see the quantity of men and guns. Equiano and Dick put on board the salvage sloop of war and then sent to another shore. They stayed in London. His master Pascal was promoted to be the first lieutenant of the Preston man of war, and he needed to port on Royal George. Equiano did not want to leave his master, so he joined Pascal, but he left Dick on board the Preston. They arrived at the Cape Breton in the summer of 1758, and this time Equiano saw several battles. In 1759, they were returning to England, and in that year, Equiano felt great sorrow because his friend Dick died when he boarded His Majesty's ship in Preston.
2 to 3 years after Equiano arrived at England, he was able to speak and understand English language very well. He wants to be an Englishman, that is why he observed very keenly to those Englishmen he saw on the ship. He remembered every gesture and even the slightest movement that those men do. Equiano with his master landed to London, and he was told to wait in Miss Karen's household until his master came back. In there, he was sent to school and learned how to read and write. He was also baptized in St. Margaret's Church, Westminster in February 1759 on his present name. His churchmates, especially ladies, told him about the words of God, which he considered as sacred and valuable. When the ship was ready to set sail, his master was ordered on board, and he has no choice but to leave his master. In school, he is now started to set sail in Mediterranean Sea. They stopped point by point until they reached their destination. Upon traveling, he saw different types of suicide, which for him is a sign of cowardice. At the time of his expedition, it is a time of war between English and French, and he, together with the other slaves, was obliged to fight against the French. They won on the first battle and lost at second time. In September, the ship where he was on board sent out to service and went to Guernsey. He was very glad to see his old hostess there, who was now widowed, and he spent his time there until October. In the beginning of December, he was again on board on the ship and went to London. On his journey, he always thinks about his freedom. That is why he is eager to earn money to enable him to get a good education. While he was in Etna, the captain's clerk taught him about to write and arithmetic as far as the rule of 3. There is also a man named Daniel Quinn who is well educated, who instructed him regarding many things and taught him about shaving, hairdressing, and reading a Bible. Equiano was confident about his master's word that he would let him go as a free man, not until the day he was sold again to the man named Captain Doran, his new master. He told them that he was a free man and no one can buy him because all his prize money was taken by his master for the sake of his freedom. Captain Doran was very mad and told him that he talked too much English. He was threatened to his life that enables him to shut his mouth, and the only thing he could do is watch his previous master walk away. His mind now is full of sorrow and anguish. Equiano was asking himself if he'd do something that might offend God, that is why he was suffering. Captain Doran called him and told him that he should behave himself well like the other boys, and he made no response. When they arrive at a Mother Bank Portsmouth, he uses all the means to get a boat from the shore. A sailor took his guinea, promising that he will bring a boat to Equiano, but the sailor didn't do his promise. On the 13th of February 1763, they arrived in the island in Montserrat, and he was unloading and loading the ship together with the other slave. In the middle of May, their ship was ready to set sail to England, and Captain Doran sent him ashore. With trembling heart, he immediately came to his master, and he saw one man named Mr. Robert King. He was again sold. Robert said that Equiano was a good character. Mr. King asked him about if he knew gauging and said no. One of Mr. King's clerks was pulled out to teach him about gauging and merchandising. He was employed on his master's business, which is collecting and sending rum, sugar, and other goods. He worked so hard and got a higher position. He went to other countries to his job. Some different gentlemen liked the performance of Equiano and asked Mr. King to sell him, but his master always refused. While working, he saw different types of cruelty on his fellow man, but he cannot do anything to help them because he was just a Negro. He was thankful to God and to his previous masters that he found a good master now, whom he treated him like a human being and not a slave. One of the vessels owned by Mr. King has a captain named Thomas, and he was fascinated by the hardship of Equiano. Thomas asked Mr. King if he could bring Equiano to the vessels that he was driving because the white man boarded on the ship was very lazy, that most of the time they complained that they are sick and drunk and cannot do their jobs. Mr. King at first hesitated, but at last he granted Thomas' request. Along the journey, Thomas treated him well and got his favor. After several times of merchandising, Equiano learned how it flows, and he then decided to take the risk of selling the product. He wants to buy his freedom to his master, that is why he is eager to find ways on how to earn money. Until one day when he was boarded on the ship, he thought himself that if he would learn how to navigate, it will be useful to him, and he did not tend to run away unless he was ill-used. He favored his lesson about navigation to his crewmen, and Captain Thomas knew about this action. Thomas did not scold him and decided to teach Equiano about navigation himself. Going back to Philadelphia, where his master lives, one Sunday morning Equiano was called by his master to go to his house, and he found his master and his captain together. His master said that he was going to sell him because he heard that he was going to run away. After Equiano's captain walked away, he told his master that he did not want to run away, and if he does, he has so many means to do that while on the journey. His master told him that he tested him many times if he would run away, but to his great surprise, he did not. Equiano was delighted and very happy upon hearing those words to his master. He continues his work in his master's ship and earned money. He soon came to Georgia, and on the yard of Dr. Perkins and a ruffian man who doesn't like a Negro man, and they started to beat Equiano. He was jailed all night, and his captain doesn't even know where he is. A good man saw him and took him for best doctor in town, but all of them said that he was not going to live. After knowing the incident, his captain went to Dr. Perkins and swearing that he would be revenge of him. Through the skillfulness of Dr. Brady, he was treated. He spent his 16 to 18 days in bed. After 4 weeks, he was now able to go on duty. In less than 3 weeks, they arrived safe at Montserrat, and this ended this adventure in year 1764 and did not leave Montserrat till the beginning of the following year.
In early 1766, King bought another ship, the Nancy, which was stocked for a trip to Philadelphia. The ship was the largest Equiano had ever seen, so he filled it with as much of his own merchandise as he could. On this trip, he saw whales for the first time. In Philadelphia, he sold his goods mostly to the Quakers, who were the most honest seeming to him. Equiano passed a meeting house one Sunday morning and observed a tall woman talking something he didn't understand through an open door. Then he arrived to another church full with people. He inquired further and discovered that the Reverend George Whitefield, whom he'd heard of before, was preaching. Equiano was amazed and struck by such exertion. King may be kinder than other masters, but ultimately his priority is economic. Equiano has been successful enough to gather more than the required amount, or the 40 pounds, to buy his release. Even without the extra monies, Equiano had hope to receive from the silversmith. In this moment, Equiano rises to rhetorical heights, perhaps influenced by the powerful rhetoric of the preacher he saw in Philadelphia. Equiano considers freedom to be so vital that he would rather die free than be enslaved again, even if freedom has shown to be less than the unquestionable good he previously envisioned it to be. Farmer 2 is relatively kind and fair towards Equiano, but he is ultimately concerned with his bottom line rather than what is best for Equiano. He demonstrates his capacity to challenge prejudices about black people's inferiority through his own life after Farmer's death, proving himself to be a much more successful captain than the mate. More than ever, Equiano wanted to return to England, but in response to Mr. King's entreaties, he resolved to go on another voyage to Georgia, since the mate was still ill. They gathered slaves and set off under a new commander, William Phillips. Equiano had dreamed 3 nights in a row of shipwreck in which he saved everyone on board. One of these evenings, while fatigued at the pump, he resent the label. The navigator pointed out a grampus to Equiano on the 3rd night, but it turned out to be a rock. Equiano's thoughts returned to his dream, which had now come true, and he came to the conclusion that if anyone had died, God would have held Equiano responsible, perhaps why he'd worked so hard to save the slaves. The crew learned that this island was one of the Bahamas. They caught sight of flamingos, which they first worried were cannibals. There were also turtles and fish throughout. Phillips, Equiano, and 5 others set out with scant provisions. After 11 days, on the 2nd day they reached Abico, the largest on the Bahamas. By this time, they were exhausted and had run out of water, and they couldn't find water or people on the island all night. The next day, they set off again but couldn't find a single ship, though they did manage to find water on another key. Equiano is as skilled as any sailor given his many years at sea, but he recognizes the ways in which sailing can be treacherous for anyone because of the larger laws of nature or providence that remain indifferent to human desire. Eventually, Equiano found a place on a ship bound for the French island Martinico, or the Martinique. Before he left, a black woman whose child had just died asked Equiano to perform its burial service, as no white person would. Though he told her he wasn't a parson, she wouldn't stop asking him. So finally, he performed the service before he set sail.
Equiano promised to himself that he will never going back to Georgia because the way he was treated there. He was happy and enjoying Martinique because the slaves like him was treated better there. Equiano wanted to go to Montserrat to bid goodbye to Mr. King, but Equiano delayed from going back because he lent some money to Phillips, which Phillips refused to pay him back. Equiano didn't stop, but he argued with Phillips until their relationship became worse and until he got his money. He arrived in St. Kitts on July 19. Equiano wanted to take the next ship to Montserrat, but the captain refused to take him until he advertised himself, that is, gave notice he was leaving. Equiano met once again Mr. King, and King expressed sorrow that Equiano was leaving for London, and he asked Equiano to stay. In a while, he said Equiano could have land and slave himself. Equiano thanked King, for he declined, but rather asked King for a certificate of his behavior in his service, which King was happy to give. After 7 weeks, they arrived in London. He went in search of Miss Kearns. Then Miss Karen were curious to know what Equiano wanted to do in life. They helped place him with a hairdresser in Coventry Court, where he spent close 6 months learning how to dress hair. In February 1768, Equiano was hired by Dr. Charles Irving, a kind master who allowed him to attend school in the evenings. But the wages were so small that Equiano decided to go to sea again for a time to make more money. On the ship called the Delaware, they sailed first to France and Italy, and then to Smyrna, an ancient Turkish city rich in food and with a population generally kind to black people. Equiano was very surprised to really see a woman who has covered head to toe with a veil. He also noticed that Greeks are servitude to Turks and as like blacks elsewhere to white. In 1771, Equiano returned in another ship to the West Indies. There, a white man bought some of his goods, but refused to pay him back. But this white man was also indebted to 3 white sailors, so the man finally paid them back, and they accepted it. Equiano left Jamaica and he saw so many blacks who were employed in plugging others. In May 1773, Equiano decided to travel again, and he was part of an expedition to seek passage to India through the North Pole. He was given a small room, but upon writing his journal, his candle was lit a thread and it caused to a fire. Equiano was at the edge of death when others managed to put out the fire. On June 28, they arrived in Greenland. By August, Equiano's ship and partner were nearly shut in by 2 huge sheets of ice, and after 11 days of being trapped by the ice, it seems like they are very lucky because the ice breaks on its own. Back in London, Equiano began to reflect on his near brush with death, and on the necessity of acknowledging the grace of God. He left the service of Dr. Irving and spent a great deal of time thinking about the salvation of the soul and how he might become a better Christian. He saw no one around him who kept all 10 commandments, and he felt that the Turks were in fact much more righteous than those calling themselves Christian. He decided to return to Turkey. In early 1774, Equiano found the captain bound for Smyrna, and he recommended a black man, John Annis, to join on a scout. Annis left Kirkpatrick's, but on the way to Smyrna, his former master learned that Annis went on board, and he took him away for force. Equiano tried to save him, but he failed, and knew that Annis and St. Kitts, he was whipped brutally and put into irons. Equiano think about his own sins, and his only comfort was reading the Bible, especially the verse that reads, "There is no new things under the sun." One day, as he was wandering through Smyrna, Equiano met his old former sailor, and this man was confident in God's love. And Equiano eagerly began to question him, and he gave Equiano some things to read, and invited him to chapel in that evening for peace. The evening, Equiano was surprised to see many ministers, but no eating and drinking. Some speakers began to relate the experience to God's providence and mercy. Equiano was very grateful, and he'd never seen this kind of Christian fellowship, and that evening was ended by a simple meal. Equiano returned home, and he was shocked to hear God's name taken in vain. He returned to see his new acquaintance, Mr. C, the next day, and he received from him a book called The Conversion of an Indian. He found it fascinating and learned it from 2 months. Equiano was hired again for a ship to Cadiz in Spain. He was upset hearing the name of God taken in vain, and he nearly once threw himself off the ship. But he remembered the Bible's injunction against suicide. One evening while reading, Equiano thinks that he had indeed lived a good life, but he wondered if this was enough for salvation. God broke on him, and Equiano saw a vision of Jesus Christ crucified on the cross, bearing the sins of all. He stopped for fearing death because he knows that God will save a sinner like him. Equiano was still puzzled about certain Bible verse, so he went to see a famous reverend preach at Blackfriars Church. He returned to chapel where his friends were delighted at the change in him. Equiano transcribed a poem about his youth and enslavement and his desires for death. The poem recounts his dejection and despair as he wandered over the seas. and finally the moment of light when he felt spiritually reborn.
In 1775, Equiano left again for Cadiz. The trip was smooth until the ship hit against a rock. Many people began to cry and shout, but Equiano remained calm and didn't fear them, and many sheep came to help them. Going to Malaga, Equiano saw a fine cathedral and he had a conversation with a priest who said that Equiano should go to a Spanish university to be a black pope. But Equiano refused. When they returned to England, the winds were strong and Equiano saw a small boat with 11 half-drowned men who had abandoned their ship. When they got a rescue, they thanked God. Even the captain thanks God for giving him an opportunity to repent. During November, Dr. Irving bought a large ship which goes to Jamaica and Mosquito Shore. Equiano agreed to go with him in order to convert some natives, but Equiano met 4 Indian chiefs which he escorted to the church. During the trip, Equiano taught Mosquito Prince George about Christianity, but some sailors mocked Prince George about their conversation. Then Prince George don't want anymore to spend time with Equiano and started to ask why white men who knows all things still lie and get drunk. Equiano said to him that they failed to fear God. When in Jamaica, Equiano accompanied Irving to forcase slaves. Indians regularly came, even the Indian governor, to trade with them. Equiano asked leave and Irving allowed him to go. He also received a certificate of good behavior. However, Hughes, one of the owners, asked him to stay at the ship, but Equiano refused. So Hughes became mad, never let Equiano leave. He let his men tie Equiano, pull him up, and hang all night. When Equiano was free, a friend helped him to escape while the captain stays in the lower deck. He went to other owner to tell him of what happened, and the owner apologized and treated him well. Equiano continued to an admiral who sent 5 Indians to accompany him to another ship. In a new ship, he was forced to do a hard labor. They met a smaller ship controlled by John Baker, who offered him to take in Jamaica. But Baker lied. He leads Equiano to Cartagena and treated cruelly, where Equiano experienced a day without food. He prayed to God for relief, then instantly he saw a large fish that jumped into the deck and thanked to God. Equiano heard that the plantation hired a white overseer and was cruel to the slave who tried to escape in canoes, but all of them drowned. Equiano found a ship bound for England, and later on he heard Dr. Irving died after eating a poisonous fish, and at the end he went to London thanking God for his mercy. In 1777, Equiano was hired as a servant by Governor McNamara, who wanted him to be a missionary in Africa. He produced a letter of application written from Gustavus Vasa, but the bishop declined to ordain him. In 1783, Equiano visited Wales and saw a coal pit and nearly lost his life because of the coals fell in. In 1785, Equiano traveled to Philadelphia and was glad to see a Quakers treated the Africans well. When Equiano heard that the British government decided to send some Africans back to their native land, Equiano was chosen to be in charge, so he agreed to help his countrymen, hoping that British government will restore freedom and justice to the slaves. He also asked God to enlighten the British senators. He argues to stop inhuman slave trade and a system of exchange needed to be adopted in Africa to increase the demand of goods and promote adjustment in manners and customs. Also, putting an end of slavery would be a universal good. In 1791, Equiano traveled to Dublin and around Ireland, and in London, he heard that edition of his narrative had been published. He has learned to look for the hand of God in all doings, even in a little thing.